Friends, as all of you know, is an auspicious day today, Shri Krishna Janmashtami Day. And it is on this auspicious day that we are going to take up a discourse on Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita. And more wonderful is it that we are going to take up the chapter called the Divine Teacher. That is the second chapter in the essays on the Gita. Well, some of you here attended my discourse on chapter 1, which was done at Sakar last February. In fact, it is just a coincidence that we have also taken up at Sakar a study of the essays on the Gita. And every February and August darshan, we are having regular discourses for 3 to 4 days. So in our last session, we completed chapter 1. So this time I am going to take up the Divine Teacher, and on this day of Janmashtami to speak about Sri Krishna is, I think, a great grace. Then the question is, when we speak of Sri Krishna, about which Krishna are we going to speak about? Because there are many sides to this question of Krishna, or maybe we may say many personalities. And over the different ages, people have really taken him on a different personality. For example, in fact, I've taken this from one of Sri Aurobindo's own letters when he was asked to compare himself with Sri Krishna. He says, with which Sri Krishna should I compare myself? Because we have Sri Krishna, the transcendent, the Godhead, Paramatma, Parabrahma, Purushottama. That's the one aspect of Sri Krishna, the transcendental aspect. Then we have the cosmic deity, master of the universe, Vasudeva, who is all, the cosmic aspect. Then we have the avatar Sri Krishna, the Godhead who was incarnate at Vrindavan and Dwarka. And as Sri Aurobindo writes in that letter, he was my guide, the guide of my yoga, with whom I realized identity. So we have that avatar, Sri Krishna, with whom Sri Aurobindo realized a complete identity. And as all of you know here, it was on 24th November 1926. Then we have Sri Krishna, who is considered as the immanent divine, the inner divine. And that too, most of you know here, the mother herself was given this hint when she started reading the Bhagavad Gita in Paris. The person who gave her the book just gave her one hint saying that consider Sri Krishna as the inner guide. So that is another aspect of Sri Krishna. Then we have Sri Krishna, the secret center and guide in the Mahabharata. The one person who is behind all the events and incidents of the Mahabharata, sometimes guiding people, other times helping people, and at all times moving this whole motion of Mahabharata to his own idea, to his own work, to his own ideal for which he was born at that time. And what was that ideal? That is the last part, what we normally say, the historical Sri Krishna. The historical Sri Krishna, who was a leader, a great warrior, and best of all, a wonderful statesman. So you see, we have so many levels of Sri Krishna when we speak about the great Lord. So each one of us enjoys perhaps a bit of the avatar, a bit of the leader, a bit of the guide, a bit of the statesman. And those who have really taken to a spiritual path, they can realize him as the inner guide. Then as Sri Aurobindo himself saw, the cosmic deity. And then of course, as Sri Krishna himself says, I am Purushottama. So it all depends upon our own consciousness, at what level we are in order to appreciate Sri Krishna. You see, one thing, emotionally we may have a kind of contact with him, but on what level do we realize him? And we have stories galore wherein we hear how Sri Krishna appears to people, how in fact, there was a letter I was reading from Sri Aurobindo, where he says, because somebody asked him, how is it that some people can hear Sri Krishna's call and others don't? The great call of Sri Krishna's flute. So Sri Aurobindo would say, in fact, it is he who chooses, the one who can hear his call. So it's not a question of your incapacity. The Lord himself chooses to whom he can make hear his great call. So there is this kind of inner bidding, whereas it is said, it's a choice of the Lord and it is left to him to whom he reveals himself. So we have so many sides to this enigmatic figure Sri Krishna. In fact, he has become so very enigmatic and mystical that some people have begun to consider him only as a symbol, as a metaphor. So Sri Aurobindo would say, there have been so many sides to Sri Krishna, we have to now decipher which one are we going to appreciate and take up in this essay on the Gita or in the Gita, Bhagavad Gita itself. Before I take up this aspect and go deeper into this chapter, the divine teacher, I think it is important to get a bit of the background of the Gita itself. You see, the most peculiar thing about the Bhagavad Gita, when Sri Aurobindo discusses about it, we see there are 2 points about the Gita which are pretty unique to it. We have so many scriptures in the world and we know them. Some of us have read them, some of us have followed them, perhaps some of us have only heard about them, a bit of their contents. But all the scriptures, they have a central truth, no doubt about it. But the beauty is they all express one single truth. And Sri Aurobindo would say that there is one eternal truth, a single truth, which is expressing itself in all scriptures, but in varied ways or varied purposes and at different times. But then the important thing is that no single scripture can really catch this whole truth and the complete truth. He would say here, I quote him from the Essays on the Gita, page 2, first of all, there is undoubtedly a truth, one and eternal, which we are seeking, from which all other truth derives, by the light of which all other truth finds its place, explanation, relation to the scheme of knowledge. But precisely for that reason, it cannot be shut up in a single trenchant formula. It is not likely to be found in its entirety or in all its bearings in any single philosophy or scripture, or uttered altogether and forever by any one teacher, thinker, prophet, or avatar. You see, right in the beginning, Sri Aurobindo is so wide in his approach. So it is not that he is a Hindu philosopher or supporting the Vedas or supporting the Upanishads. So right before he enters into the appreciation of the Bhagavad Gita, he would tell us that no scripture can really shut up in a single trenchant formula the whole truth. Not only that, he says no one teacher or thinker or prophet or avatar can capture the whole truth. So it is in this line what we have to see. Some of you perhaps heard me the other day when I gave a talk on renunciation. So Sri Aurobindo's view is always this, that there is always the truth beyond. The truth for the moment is what is there for the present manifestation. But truth always exceeds all scriptures. And in fact, all scriptures put together also cannot capture the truth in its totality. So this being his wide understanding, Sri Aurobindo would say that there is again a second aspect of a scripture. One is that no scripture can shut up or capture the whole truth. Secondly, what is interesting and relevant for the Gita is that every scripture has got two aspects. As Sri Aurobindo calls two elements, one temporary, perishable, and the other eternal and imperishable. So this is something that most people do not understand. That is where our fanaticism of religion comes in. Because we feel that whatever our scripture has said is the whole truth, and it is the eternal truth, and it should not be interpreted, it should not be touched or changed. But on the contrary, most of the scriptures have this double aspect. The temporary, the perishable, belonging to the ideas of the period and country in which it was produced. Obviously, any scripture, if it has to be relevant, it has to reflect the times, it has to reflect the culture, it has to reflect the traditions. You see, take Quran, the circumstances in which it was born, it has to take into consideration the historical circumstances, the geographical circumstances, the psychological circumstances. Take, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita. Again, the whole thing is there, how Sri Krishna gives us the essence of the Gita. In fact, when we study the historical truth about Sri Krishna, we will come to know that Sri Krishna was already a founder and leader of a religion called Bhagavata religion. Long before the Gita was produced or was written or spoken of or spoken, there was an existent religion called the Bhagavata religion, of which Sri Krishna himself was the teacher and the founder. So you see, obviously what he has given in the Gita is the teaching that he had already given to the people at that time in general. And then there was the question of the Upanishadic thought that was prevalent at that time. So all that gets reflected in the Bhagavad Gita, just as Quran reflects its own circumstances and the wars and all that. So was so with Christianity, with Bible. So this is there what we call the temporary things. But there is the eternal, the imperishable, and applicable in all ages and countries. So this eternal truth is something that is there, which has been experienced, which is lived and seen with a higher than the intellectual vision. And this eternal truth is that which spreads to all countries. So now you see, when we consider the Bhagavad Gita, he would tell us that there is little that is merely local or temporal in the Gita. So the first unique point about the Gita is that there is very little of the local or the temporal. Whereas in the other scriptures, you will find a lot of this local and the temporal, but in the Bhagavad Gita, that is its uniqueness, it has hardly anything of the local and the temporal. Except for the Sanskrit terminology, if you read it in English and if there's a good translation, you will not find much of the Indianism in that. It is so universal and vast that anybody can apply it, take it up without much of any religious background or a cultural background. And I suppose this is exactly what we see once again in Sri Aurobindo. There is in fact hardly anything of the temporal and the local. He has written that in Pondicherry between 1914 and 20. But you don't see anything of the times or the place, except that he has chosen the words Brahman and Satchidanand and Atman from our Sanskrit terminology. Otherwise, Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine or Savitri or Synthesis, any of his books, they do not reflect anything of the local or the temporal. So after the Gita, it's again in Sri Aurobindo where we see this eternal, imperishable aspect of his thought and experience, and that is why Sri Aurobindo is so widely and rapidly being accepted in the whole world, because he, as he writes here, is applicable to all ages and countries. And this is the beauty here. The Sri Aurobindo says that only those scriptures, religions, philosophies, which can be thus constantly renewed, relived, their stuff of permanent truth constantly reshaped and developed in the inner thought and spiritual experience of a developing humanity, continue to be of living importance to mankind. The rest remain as monuments of the past, but have no actual force or vital impulse for the future. So he gives the great importance to this question of every scripture renewing itself, it being relived, the stuff of permanent truth constantly reshaped and developed in the inner thought. And here is the strength of the Gita, that over the ages, since the time it was written, there have been so many interpretations, so many people have lived it, so many people have contacted the great inner Lord Sri Krishna. And then it has never fought shy of being interpreted. And this kind of an interpretation is rigid with all the other scriptures of the world. Gita is one which is flexible, it is really relived and reinterpreted. And that is one of the strengths of the Gita. So today, Sri Aurobindo has brought in his own explanation, released a new force. With each interpretation, the Gita finds its own relevance to the times. And if today Sri Aurobindo has reinterpreted it, because the times have changed, we demand something more from the Gita, not just a philosophy of action, not the philosophy of renunciation, not the philosophy of asceticism, not just the philosophy of devotion, and not of knowledge. Because in the past, every interpreter has emphasized only on one of these things. But today, the age demands an integral approach to life. We cannot be compartmentalized into devotion and knowledge or bhakti or karma. And the demand of the times is an integrality of vision. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo brings in this new interpretation with this emphasis upon the integral aspect, which in fact is the central truth of the Gita. Unfortunately, its integral approach was not understood or taken up by the previous times, because there is not the demand of the times. At that time, people wanted to do karma or asceticism or bhakti or this, so they very conveniently turned the Gita towards their own realization and truth. But the real truth of the Gita is its integralism. Because remember, Gita follows the line of the Vedas and the Vedanta. So we have actually three integral syntheses. One was the Vedas and the Vedanta. Then comes the Gita. And then now comes Sri Aurobindo. So these are the strides of integralism in Hindu spiritual thought. Whereas all other interpretations and all other philosophies have taken one aspect of human growth, which of course was necessary for those times. But as Sri Aurobindo would tell us, in every yuga, this integral aspect comes to humanity. So in Dwapara, verging on Kali Yuga, there was Sri Krishna who brings in. In Satya Yuga, there was the Vedanta which brought in the integralism. The Dwapara Kali, it is Sri Krishna. And now, between the Kali and the new Satya Yuga comes Sri Aurobindo once again with his integral philosophy. So you can see the importance and the connection between the Vedas Vedanta, Bhagavad Gita and Sri Aurobindo. Well, having said that, that is the first unique aspect of the Bhagavad Gita. What is it? To repeat once again, this essential spiritual truth are eternal. There's nothing much of local or temporary things in the Gita. And the greatness of the Gita has been that it has allowed itself to be interpreted according to the need of the times. It has never said, I am untouchable, nobody should interpret me, every word I've said is the finale. No. Words are unchanged, but the interpretation, it is a wonderful book in the sense that it has always reflected the times. Whatever the need or the demand of the times, Gita said, I will release that force. So today, if integralism is the demand of the times, Gita says, I will release that force. So that is the marvelous thing about the scripture, that it reflects the need of the times and gives the necessary strength to push humanity further. So it is not just literally when Sri Krishna says, I come from age to age, yuge, yuge. It is not just his coming. It is yuge, yuge, his force is there continuously, all the time pushing humanity forward. And in this yuga, the Kali Yuga transiting into this new Satya Yuga that Sri Aurobindo speaks of, this force, this consciousness has once again liberated itself but renewed its form in the form of Sri Aurobindo. We should understand that. You see, how has Sri Krishna rejuvenated himself, renewed himself, reinforced himself, reincarnated himself? That is by identifying himself with Sri Aurobindo, and that is why Sri Aurobindo, which I read out right in the beginning, wherein he says, I was completely, he says, the guide with whom I realized identity. So Sri Krishna and Sri Aurobindo achieved this identity for the purpose of a new yuga that is coming forth. And one more thing before I proceed to chapter 2. There's one line here, which from the chapter 1, the last paragraph, he says, but just as the past syntheses have taken those which preceded them for their starting point, so also must that of the future, to be on firm ground, proceed from what the great bodies of realized spiritual thought and experience in the past have given. Among them, the Gita takes a most important place. So this is the tradition that we have had in India, that always one scripture has stood upon the previous scripture. That means the Gita has stood upon the Upanishads, the Upanishads upon the Vedas, and upon the Gita there have been other people, other schools of thought. But now comes Sri Aurobindo with his integral philosophy. So he too says, my starting point is the Gita. So you see the connection? He says it is the law almost, that just as the past syntheses have taken those which preceded them for their starting points, so also must that of the future. So now the relevance and the importance of the Bhagavad Gita for Sri Aurobindo is exactly this, that it is the starting point of his own yoga, remember, of his own philosophy. And therefore let us not be surprised that when Sri Krishna appeared to Sri Aurobindo, and gave him and guided him regarding his new integral yoga. Obviously, he was pushing Sri Aurobindo onto the new path, and when Sri Aurobindo was ready in his own tapasya, that at the behest of the mother, as most of you would know, around the 24th of November, Sri Krishna was hovering in the atmosphere around Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And the mother commanded, saying, "Why don't you come in? It's time." And then Sri Krishna descends into Sri Aurobindo. That was the great darshan day, the day of the Siddhi day, what we say. So you see, it is not story, it is not just event. It is almost a historical process that is being followed. The Upanishads, the Gita, the Lord Sri Krishna entering into Sri Aurobindo and continuing the work. And that's why Sri Aurobindo was not hesitant to say, Sri Krishna's work is being continued in the ashram. So you see, all these things merge together once we understand the innate and the inseparable link between the Bhagavad Gita and Sri Aurobindo. That is why to many people have said, if you want to understand Sri Aurobindo, first read the essays on the Gita. Because that is the linking point. Because if you read other interpretations of the Gita and then come to Sri Aurobindo, you will not understand Sri Aurobindo. Because they have not given the whole picture of Gita. They have cut it into pieces and they have interpreted it on single lines of thought. So the best introduction to Sri Aurobindo is essays on the Gita, no doubt about it. So that's why with this attitude only I had taken up the study of the essays on the Gita. And I know some of you here have attended our evening classes where I had taken the part 2 of essays on the Gita and completed that. So that in the Hall of Harmony we did for quite many years. I completed part 2 at that time. But then I felt it is incomplete if we do not really work on the part 1 also. So that's why at Sakar we took up the study. Now that is point 1 I discussed about. The uniqueness of the Gita has 2 points. 1, the essential, the eternal aspect. Now what is the second aspect? Which is absolutely unique to the Bhagavad Gita. No other scripture can claim to that. And that is the circumstance in which Gita was born. You see, there are 3 things in the Gita: the divine speaker, the teacher, Sri Krishna. Then we have the great disciple, Arjuna. He is great not because of by himself or because of himself. He is great because of his relations with the Lord, with Sri Krishna. And third is the occasion, the circumstance, the event. These are the 3 important points in the Gita that Sri Aurobindo is going to take up here. What we see now, chapter 2 is the divine teacher, and then chapter 3, the human disciple. And then the circumstance, in fact, he takes up right in the beginning of this chapter 2 itself. So this is the second most unique point. All other scriptures were born out of one original person's tapasya, realization, whatever you want to call. Bible was born out of Christ's tapasya, Quran out of Muhammad's realization, and we have here Buddhism out of the Buddha's own realization. But you cannot say Bhagavad Gita was born out of Sri Krishna's realization. Nor can we say, like the Vedas and the Upanishads, that it was a collective effort, as Sri Aurobindo would call it. It is an epoch of pure spiritual seeking. You say, how were the Vedas and the Upanishads born? It was an epoch, a great time when there were dozens of great yogis doing this great tapasya, bringing down that higher levels of consciousness. And out of that epoch, some yogis predominated and they wrote down some of these Vedas, not the Upanishads. But again, there's nothing like that in the Upanishad, in the Gita. Of course, we say the great person, the speaker is Lord Krishna. But you may say, Bible is spoken by Christ. So that gets, equal. You may say the great Buddhism, the Tripitakas, the scriptures of the Buddha or Buddhism were spoken by the Buddha. So you can say Bhagavad Gita was spoken by Sri Krishna. So they are all equal. So what Sri Aurobindo tells us is that even this point of Sri Krishna being the main speaker of Bhagavad Gita is not as important as the circumstance. Right in the beginning, he says the uniqueness of the Gita, apart from its eternal truth, the uniqueness is the event. What we have in Savitri, across the path of the great event. Even Savitri is that event. The whole thing gets hooked to the event of this is the day Satyavan must die. You see, Savitri is not a philosophy saying once upon a time and this was that and there was a great Savitri and Satyavan symbolizing this and that. No. It's exactly like the Gita. It starts with the event of death. This was the day when Satyavan must die. And on a single line, the whole of Savitri is developed. The whole symbolism, the greatness, the experience, the inner, the outer, the heights, the depths, everything hinges on that single line. This was the day when Satyavan must die. So across the path of the divine event, that's right in the beginning of Savitri, Sri Aurobindo says that he is going to describe that event from different levels. So if Savitri is an event, so too is Bhagavad Gita an event, a circumstance. So that is the uniqueness here. I'll read out the first line of this chapter 2, the Divine Teacher. He says, the peculiarity of the Gita among the great religious books of the world is that it does not stand apart as a work by itself, the fruit of the spiritual life of a creative personality like Christ, Muhammad, or Buddha, or of an epoch of pure spiritual searching like the Veda and the Upanishads. But it is given as an episode in an epic history of nations and their wars and men and their deeds, and arises out of a critical moment in the soul of one of its leading personages, face to face with the crowning action of his life, a work terrible, violent, and sanguinary, at the point when he must either recoil from it altogether or carry it through to its inexorable completion. I don't think we have read anything by anyone else wherein they lay so much emphasis upon this circumstance. In fact, to explain that further down the page, if you have the books, you can see. The teachings of the Gita must therefore be regarded not merely in the light of a general spiritual philosophy or ethical doctrine, but as a bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality to human life. So why is Gita important? Not just because it is because of its general spiritual philosophy. In fact, in chapter 1 he would say, the whole philosophy of the Gita is not important, because it can become a philosophic dogma. But what is important are these living experiences. He would call them that this is the ideas that are there. The philosophical system of the Gita is not important, but the principal ideas. And well, I'm not getting into those ideas because those of you who would like to see them elaborated, see Essays on the Gita, page 4, which we discussed in our last class, so I'm not going into those details. But the principal ideas are eternally valuable because they are enduring truths of spiritual experience. So these ideas are important. Secondly, the way they have been imparted. Sri Krishna does not say, I'm giving this to my disciples sitting in a cozy corner in the evening when all is silent. That is why Gita becomes much more relevant than any scripture that we have had in India, because we have exactly life problems. Others can be solutions in your meditations, for your bhakti, songs of Mirabai Bhakti, bhajan. But when you are working in life, you come face to face with problems. So, Gita is the solution to life problems, not your intellectual or devotional or all these problems. No. So, you say, is bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality. So, you see, we speak so much about ethics, but then how are they important? You see, we have spoken about asceticism, doing this and doing that. But how can we apply them in life? So the Gita shows us through the circumstances how they are applicable. Now, if circumstance is what is important, we have to now see what exactly is this circumstance. The event, as Sri Aurobindo calls it. What is that event? And all of us know that. Know that perhaps some in detail, some would know it in detail, and others perhaps do not know. Well, here I'll read out something from Sri Aurobindo's own writings that was originally written in Bengali but translated. What is the circumstance? We have the beginning of Kurukshetra. The two armies are facing each other. We all know that. But then Duryodhan first gives a great speech. In fact, in his speech, he challenges Bhishma and Dronacharya. Challenges in the sense, he is a bit doubtful if Bhishma would fight for him. Although Bhishma is the commander-in-chief of the Kauravas, but Duryodhana knows that Bhishma in the heart of hearts is on the side of Pandavas. You see, it's a great psychological play that is taking place. So Duryodhana wants to be sure that Bhishma and Dronacharya, an Acharya like him, if he is not on his side, there is no possible victory. And at the same time, we know that the army of Duryodhana was 10 times bigger and stronger perhaps than that of these Pandavas. And yet the importance of Bhishma and Dronacharya was utmost, and that Duryodhana knows in his heart of hearts. So he calls upon Bhishma and Dronacharya to take up this challenge. He kind of, challenges them and says, come on, start the war. And Bhishma Pitamaha, we will discuss about him, his character when it comes to, when we, in the right time perhaps. He was a very singular person. One who believed, who knew what truth was, and that truth was with the Pandavas. And he also knew the avatarhood of Sri Krishna. And yet when it comes to the war, he stands against Pandavas. Why? Well, we will see later. However, the starting point is, we have this great speech by Duryodhana, and everybody is ready. And in order to assuage the doubts of Duryodhana, Bhishma Pitama, he blows upon his conch. Because in those times, blowing up on the conch was a signal that we are ready for the war. So at that time, when Duryodhana hears the conch being blown by Bhishma, he feels happy. He says, now my victory is sure, because now Bhishma is with me and Dronacharya is with me. So the war began, and missiles began to fly from both sides, the beginning missiles. At this juncture, Arjuna said to Sri Krishna, "You please place my chariot at a point between the two armies. I wish to see who are our antagonists. Who are they who have come to this war to act according to the pleasure of the misguided Duryodhana? Who are those with whom I have to fight?" Till that point, remember, Arjuna was a true Kshatriya. No defeatism comes in his mind. He was a true warrior and a wonderful Kshatriya, and one who knew that the entire Pandavas are depending on him for the victory. He was conscious and he was able, he was capable, he was the right instrument, he was the confidence. So he says, Arjuna's idea was that the Pandavas centered their hopes on him alone, and it was for him to kill the principal fighters on the opposite side, and therefore he must see who these were. And then, as in the army, you can see, Sri Aurobindo describes, many of India's most heroic men were present in the opposing army. Arjuna was keen on giving to elder brother Yudhishthira undisputed empire by killing them all. You see, Arjuna was very confident. But here is one hint which we read nowhere else. And Sri Aurobindo says, but Sri Krishna knew that Arjuna harbored a weakness in his mind. If this mind were not cleansed now, that weakness might suddenly come up from there and occupy the higher intelligence at any moment, and this would cause great harm to the Pandavas, perhaps even lead to their ruin. That the great psychologist, the great Lord knew, that now Arjuna is all heroic, but there is some weakness which, if it comes after starting the war, then the war is doomed. So, very cleverly what he does, for this reason Sri Krishna placed the chariot in such a place that those dear to Arjuna, like Bhishma and Drona, were just in front, and at the same time all the other princes on the side of Kauravas were within sight. And he said to Arjuna, "See and have a look at the Kuru clan gathered here." Simple words. But what a great psychologist. Simple words, and Sri Aurobindo is that mastermind who alone can read, I suppose, Sri Krishna's mind. So he says, it has to be recalled that Arjuna himself belonged to the Kuru clan, was a pride of the Kuru family. All his relatives, the men dear to him, the companions of his childhood belonged to the same Kuru clan. That will make one realize the profound idea and significance of these few ordinary words from Krishna's mouth. So you see, by simple words he has said, this is your Kuru clan, and this is the clan that you have to destroy. And imagine the whole clan is nothing but the great clan of Arjuna, his friends and his acharyas, everybody. Arjuna could now see that those whom he has to kill in order to found the undisputed empire of Yudhishthira were none other than his own dear relatives, teachers, friends, the objects of love and devotion. He saw that the Kshatriya families of the whole of India were bound together by ties of affection, and yet had come to the terrible field of battle to kill one another. What was Sri Krishna's psychology? That is showing them face to face. And he is putting Arjuna purposely before Bhishma and Drona, so that that weakness comes forward. If you see, if he was taken to some other corner where Arjuna would not have come face to face with these great figures, he would have said, okay, let's start the fight. And then later, when he really comes across Bhishma and Drona, then the weakness would have come out. But Sri Krishna tactfully brings him right there. And then, of course, the rest all of you know what happened. The great despondence that comes over our Arjuna, and that is one thing that we need to understand, because this is still the event. We are not yet getting into Arjuna's psychology, which we will take up only in chapter 3. We'll go into great detail in the human disciple. I'm not coming to that. But here, still upon considering the event, Sri Aurobindo again writes, the time was the commencement of the war. Those who have not developed or put to test their heroic qualities or strength in a mighty flood of action can never be fit to receive the knowledge given in the Gita. Moreover, those who have embarked on a great and difficult endeavor, an endeavor which automatically gives rise to many obstacles and obstructions, many enmities, fears of many setbacks, when in the course of that great endeavor there is acquired a divine strength. To them, at that moment, in order to take the endeavor to its final conclusion for the successful carrying out of the divine's work, is this knowledge revealed. The Gita lays down in the yoga of works the foundations of the path to God. Now, this is something where Sri Aurobindo now explains. We have seen the war scenario and why Sri Krishna deliberately takes him to the center before Bhishma and Dronacharya. And then suddenly now Sri Aurobindo would give us the psychological interpretation. He's telling us that through this work, through the battle of life, that man has to achieve this knowledge. In fact, in one of the sentences he would say that there are two ways of salvation. One through knowledge and the other through ignorance. Through knowledge we know that so-called meditations and all that, you reach the Brahman or Satchitananda or whatever, and you identify yourself with the Satchitananda. That path all of us know. I mean, we have read about it, not know ourselves, but we know, we have read through in the books. But then there is salvation in ignorance also. How is it possible? And it is that salvation through ignorance which is being shown by the Gita. And what is that salvation? To work, to go through action to knowledge. The first salvation is, it is a knowledge, it is the identification with the Brahman where all action stops, where all karma is coming to an end. But the salvation through ignorance is where through karma, through action, you are getting the knowledge. And what is this knowledge? Knowledge means, please remember, it is a very definitive term. Knowledge, whenever we say knowledge, is not this outer knowledge or is not the informative knowledge. In spirituality, knowledge is inner realization. And so through action you get knowledge, the inner realization, and wherein you see the divine in everything. That is the salvation through ignorance. In ignorance, being in this world, being in this action, you see the divine in all things. That is also another path. And Sri Krishna is showing Arjuna that path. But then ultimately he would say, I am beyond knowledge and ignorance. The great famous Isha Upanishad, which tells us, you should not concentrate on ignorance, nor must you concentrate on knowledge. You must go beyond. But for you and me, because that age of the Vedas is gone, as at least it has receded, not gone, wherein we had emphasized upon meditation and realization and identification with the Brahman. Today the times demand work. Times demand involvement in work. And so Sri Krishna becomes so very relevant that through this work you can gain knowledge. Through this work you can gain that realization to see the divine in everything. So here he would say, this is the message that he wants to give to the world, and therefore he chose a time and a circumstance which is the center of life. The center means the battle of life. And in fact, Sri Aurobindo says, it is the chariot of battle. You see, it's a metaphorical symbol to say that Sri Krishna sitting in the chariot, he is conducting the battle of life. And here, the chariot is nothing but the body itself. So the body being the charioteer is the inner Sri Krishna, and he is conducting our life. And the chariot is moving in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So is our body moving in life, meeting different circumstances, meeting a Bhishma there, meeting a Drona here, meeting a Duryodhana there. And there are all kinds of people. And sometimes the army of Kauravas is stronger. So you see, this is the real situation, and not an armchair philosophy, and not a kind of a realization where we can have Buddhism very quietly, trying to demolish your ego, going away from your desires. You are in a monastery, no problems. Whereas even the Christ, love thy neighbor, and it's all good things of life, whereas where you are in the more or less in a quieter situation. But what will Gita, what will Buddhism, what will Quran, what will Bible tell you when you are really in the middle of the problems of life? Well, after the Gita, once again, I think it's a synthesis which tells you what to do. But before Sri Aurobindo came, it was this. So the one question here, because there's one thing here, the question is, the ordinary yogin is afraid of life. He escapes from it and takes to yoga in the shelter and protection of an ashram. Life itself is the ashram for the karma yogin. The ordinary yogin desires an outward peace and silence. A disturbance of the peace impedes his inner ascesis. The karma yogin enjoys a vast peace and silence within. This state becomes deeper in the midst of external noise. Any external disturbance does not harm that inner ascesis. It remains undisturbed. I am reading out this passage only to reinforce why the Gita was given in the noise of the battlefield, in the tensions of the battlefield. Because a true karma yogin, he said, this state becomes deeper in the midst of external noise. A true karma yogin, that's why the mother would sometimes say, even in the crowd, in the bazaar, you should be able to go within. That is the true karma yoga. Not to go to the meditation room and in the attic of your house and say, I am meditating. That anybody can do. But when you are walking in the Nehru street, there you be with your inner self and call the mother and offer to her. That is the real battle of life. Not to escape from the battle of life, keep a quiet place, peaceful place, and then there put an agarbatti and do meditation. It's very easy. So he says, the karma yogin enjoys a vast peace and silence within. This state becomes deeper in the midst of external noise. Any external disturbance does not harm that inner ascesis. It remains undisturbed. People say, this I'm sure many people must have had this question, because I've been asked this question many a time. People say, how was the Sri Krishna Arjuna dialogue possible in the middle of armies going in for battle? A practical question. You see, you have got 700 verses that Sri Krishna and Arjuna have got. How could they have it in the middle of the battlefield? Both the armies are waiting, and Bhishma has already given his conch shell call. The answer is, it was possible through the power of yoga. Through that power of yoga, amidst the din of battle, at one particular spot, with Sri Krishna and Arjuna, peace reigned within and without. The noise of war could not affect these two. In this is implied another spiritual teaching applicable to works. Those who practice the Gita's yoga are the most capable workers and yet remain unattached to their work. Right in the midst of their work, they may hear the inner call of the self, desist from the work and plunge themselves in yoga and do the inner ascesis. They know that the work is God's, the fruit is His, we are instruments. Hence, they have no anxiety about the fruit of their work. They also know that the inner call comes for facilitating the yoga of works, for an improvement in the working, for the increase of knowledge and power. So, to come back to that question, through that, the answer is it is possible through the power of yoga. So, they were there, Krishna and Arjuna, in the middle of the battlefield, but through the power of yoga, there is an inner silence, and then it is not that the words were spoken, the message was transferred. It is not that when you read 700 verses, it may take you 7 hours or 6 hours or 5 hours, whatever the time. So it is not that Sri Krishna held the war for 5 hours saying, wait, I'm giving this adesh and this teaching to Arjuna, don't fight. It was that immediate transference between one consciousness and another. So it's not the question of time factor does not come in. But it is true, Sri Aurobindo would emphasize that this knowledge was given at that time. Because many people, in fact, we are going to take it in the next, after we come back from the break. Many people think that the Gita is an interpolation. That it did not actually happen in the Mahabharata. That the poet afterwards put the Gita into Mahabharata saying it will gain a bit of importance. He says, no. It is a historical incident. Kurukshetra war is an historical incident. Mahabharata is a poem based on a historical incident. So what all is given in Mahabharata is not history, but it is based on some historical facts. And one of the historical facts is Kurukshetra itself. And the most central fact of this historical fact is the Gita itself. So Sri Aurobindo comes out clear and putting to silence all doubts and debates that is Gita an interpolation or original work of the Mahabharata. It is an original work because it follows the sequence. Otherwise, if the Gita is an interpolation, 50% of its importance is gone. Then it becomes a drawing room deliberation, a philosophy class. So when Sri Aurobindo is saying, out of the two important things about the Gita, it's eternal teaching and the circumstance. And if the circumstance were not true, then Gita would be relegated to a second-class scripture. So if it stands out in the world because of its uniqueness, it is because of the circumstance. Therefore, Gita is a true incident. But the way the message has been given is more spiritual than what we normally would think it to be, a vocal or an oral teaching. Well, we will take a break at this point. Then we will take up the second aspect, that is the divine teacher. So out of the three aspects, divine teacher, the relation between Arjuna and Sri Krishna, the third aspect, that of the circumstance, we will take up now the divine teacher. And there also I will start with the lowest one, with the normal one, with not the Krishna of the times, not Krishna the avatar who comes later in the Bhagavad Gita.